G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we're looking at my team selection for race week 14 ahead of the Dutch Grand Prix this coming weekend. As always, if you're new around here and you're enjoying the content, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. Very much appreciate that. So we'll take a look at how my team did in Belgium. I know that feels like a millennium ago, but as always with these videos, we'll assess how I did in the previous race and then make, I guess, an assessment of my team in the lead up to the next race. I had 288 points in Spa. Obviously, Max pretty much underscored that. Another dominant weekend from him from start to finish. 136 points with the DRS boost, so very, very good there. Lando, probably not the weekend that we've become accustomed to in recent times with those McLaren upgrades. 15 points from him. Part of that had to do with the fact that they'd made adjustments to the car setup and didn't quite favour the wet conditions as they eventuated that weekend. He came away with 15 and you know, kind of middle of the pack in terms of points finishes. 7th in the race on Sunday, 7th in qualifying, and then 6th in the sprint. So no means spectacular, but was on, I guess, the better side of the coin between him and his teammate Oscar, who was nipped by Sainz on that first lap on the race. So he came away with a -20. I think Oscar finished with -7 for the weekend. So I guess deciding between the two, I made the right call there, but as very much is the case most weekends with these DNFs, it is certainly a degree of luck too. Sergio, another underwhelming fantasy weekend for him with that DNF in the sprint. So not a great weekend, but did make up some of those negative points by finishing second in the race and then third in qualifying. So had it not been for that DNF on Saturday, he could have certainly had a fantasy performance representative of the driver we know in fantasy. He's done very well this season, despite the fact his qualifying performances have probably been riddled with a few errors. So I wonder if he can turn the corner in the second half of the year. I expect that will be the case just because of how dominant that car is. And I think he's slowly trying to ease out of that poor patch of form we saw a number of races ago. However, the story of the weekend for my team with the budget drivers, Nico Hülkenberg, I got very lucky with him. Obviously has a reputation in fantasy for seeming to lose positions on the Sunday, even though he does have that great single lap qualifying pace that we've seen so far this season. He had 13 points, and Alex Albon, the highlight of my team, 19 points. A massive overtaking effort during the race, 16, the most of any driver we've seen in one race this season. And even though both of those drivers didn't particularly make up that many positions, neither of them finished in the points for that matter, it was still, you know, a great weekend for both fantasy drivers. So very pleased with that. I know there's always a degree of luck when it comes to picking your budget drivers with the low qualifying and points finishes opportunities. So you're very much dependent on their overtakes and positions gained, and thankfully the stars aligned. So that was a great weekend. 288 for me, up to 6.3 in the world. So very happy where I am heading into the last 10 or so races of this season. A number of chips still in hand, which I'll obviously assess closer to each of the races. But as far as things go for Belgium, a pretty solid weekend given a lot of the carnage that we saw over the course of the sprint weekend. So second part of the video, I want to take a look at my team for the Netherlands. Pretty content with where things are at right now. I think Red Bull still very dominant, as I've stressed, not assets I think I want to part with anytime soon until we see indications to suggest they aren't worthy of a position. I think Max and Red Bull Constructor will be in my team for the duration of the season. Sergio is obviously a driver that some people have already kind of parted with because of, you know, budget constraints or whatever it might be. For me, I'm very happy with him for now as well. I still very much believe in the low qualifying points floor, high points floor with the low qualifying, as well as when he does do well, can still get those points for podiums and such. So I think these three on the left-hand side are going to be staples of my team. Also McLaren, given the recent form they've had, the upgrades have worked sensationally, so I don't think the McLaren Constructor is on the chopping block for me anytime soon. But it is these three guys here. Obviously, a great weekend for Alex and Nico, but just because of that, doesn't necessarily mean they are averse to potential transfer plans. So, I mean, this is certainly one team I could run at the Dutch Grand Prix. I don't think it's a bad team by any means. Nico, for me, I was only kind of stuck in a situation where I had to go with him because of budget constraints. He's seen a price rise of 0.5, which opens the door slightly for me if I want to pivot to other assets. And then Alex, I think, given the exceptional straight line speed of that Williams, certainly a great candidate for a circuit like Monza in 2 races' time. I think the Dutch Grand Prix also got a number of straights too. If we bring up the map here, you've got 2 DRS zones, and you've got this great straight along the starting line, and a few other kind of longer straights throughout the circuit as well. So I certainly think he's not a bad option here, but depending on obviously practice times, I caveat that every single time when I make trades, there could be other alternatives for me. So if I choose not to go with this lineup, there is another one. Although I can't afford it, for those of you that have higher budget, might be able to facilitate this trade, which would involve moving out Sergio Perez, and depending on your team structure, may also require a -4 hit. But for me, I can't afford it, so I think my bed is made with Checo. But the triple McLaren lineup would involve obviously Oscar in here. It would involve George Russell instead of Checo, and I think George could certainly cover most of Perez's fantasy output. I think they are somewhat evenly matched, even though I would typically favour Red Bull over the Mercedes just because of the performances we've seen from them over the course of this entire season. And for me, obviously, I'm priced out of even the cheapest fantasy driver in Danny Rick or Logan. Oh, sorry, or Nico for that matter, I should say. 0.4 short. There might be some of you that have more budget to move up to one of these options here, but realistically, because I can't afford it, there isn't really much in the way of optionality to pivot to. So most likely, as is the case for this weekend, I'll be certainly running these three and the McLaren constructor. I think that flexibility is kind of paramount at the moment. I really like how all of those teams, or both of those teams, are performing, both as constructors and as drivers. Another alternative, if I decide to move away from Lando, is to get in Oscar instead. And I've kind of pointed this out a couple times, most recently in my watch list video, so check that out if you haven't done so already. A situation we saw last year in fantasy was where Max was so expensive that it just wasn't viable to have him in our teams. And I feel like this is somewhat of a similar situation right now, where we're seeing McLaren enter the fray as a template or a meta asset to own. And I'm not suggesting Lando is expensive at all compared to some of the other drivers on the grid, but the McLaren constructor obviously provides that coverage for his fantasy output because it is the aggregate just about of both drivers in that team. So an approach here I've thought about is potentially going for Oscar. And I really like Oscar, not just because he's an Aussie like me, but also because we've seen in qualifying, he's been able to match Lando for the last 3 or 4 races or so, just about at every circuit since Silverstone. Had it not been for Sainz, for instance, in Spa, where he clipped Oscar on the opening lap, and other things, variables that were more or less outside of Oscar's control, I've been very impressed with what we've seen from the rookie. And I think, if Oscar's able to put that car kind of around P4, P5, close to Lando, then I think he's got every chance of bettering his teammate on the Sunday. The other thing is that, at 9 million, substantially less than Lando, 14.4 Lando's price. I think you could certainly use the extra 4 or 5.5 or so to redirect to other parts of your team. And this is why I really like this. It provides, I guess, an opportunity for a more balanced team. 17.6 to use between two driver slots. So for me, I think we've seen a little bit, or at least I have, and I'll get this up on the screen. Aston Martin are expected to bring upgrades to the Dutch Grand Prix. As far as what they actually are, I can't say. There isn't really any prescriptive references to the parts of the car that Aston Martin are trying to improve. But it is a promising sign that even though they have regressed in recent weeks, and we've seen Lance and Fernando both score 23 points or less across the last 3 races. So you're averaging 7-8 points a race from a team that for the first part of the season was a feature in the template for obvious reasons. It is encouraging that they might bring some upgrades that will put them back firmly on the fantasy radar. again, much like the practice references I made earlier, don't lock in your teams until you see how these guys go on the Friday and Saturday morning. But another, I guess, Fernando is certainly the more reliable of the two Aston Martin assets. So I really like the option here to bring him in as the fourth driver and then get in someone like Joe, the overtake merchant, as that fifth. He's got that reliable overtake potential, just has a solid performance most weeks when he's not plagued with DNFs or other kind of strategy or other issues like that. So I really like the balance of this team. It facilitates, a little bit of the Aston Martin pie. You've got Lando covered here, and then Oscar, as I said, I think can match or get close to matching Lando. I think a little bit more value for money, but again, Lando's had those two podiums. He's certainly got a higher ceiling. If we go over to F1 Fantasy Tools, I'm just trying to play devil's advocate for a minute here. Norris 29.38, 29.15. Oscar 20, 20, 18 and -7. If we take out that the -20 DNF, that would be 13 for the week, assuming no other changes to overtakes and positions gains. So why don't we just filter it here to make it a little bit easier to reference. I don't necessarily think that Oscar, as I said, is a bad option. He gets close to covering Lando, but Lando's just more explosive as a fantasy asset, can get those podiums, and as a result makes him more firmly a viable option as far as output's concerned, but it really very much comes down to how you want to use that money and how that affects the rest of your team. So I know very cliched in that sense, but to be honest, I like the balance of this team. Joe for me is no longer that budget driver. He's getting close to 6 million. He's got that consistency that we want to see in this game. So really happy with how this looks. Again, we'll wait until practice, but this is one lineup I'm certainly leaning towards. The last one I would consider doing would be sticking with Lando. And keep in mind, the last two lineups I've shown also require a -4 hit. I don't think the -4, because of how many points we score every week, 200, 300 points a week, -4 on the total is really not significant whatsoever. If it was like a -10 or a -20, maybe I'd be having second thoughts about it. But realistically, like that in the grand scheme of things is nothing at all. So I'd be very happy with taking a -4. If it's getting to -8, -12 territory, then consider using your wild card or just reassessing exactly where you're going with those trades and the reliability of those drivers. But anyway, getting a bit carried away. So I guess the last build I'd look at would be a triple Red Bull, double McLaren. I had Lando before, so I would only really be kind of rotating these two slots where I had Hulkenberg and Albon. So that would give me 12. That, if we do want to cover the Aston Martin output, actually, sorry, this wouldn't involve Lando. I am getting a little lost here. That would involve Alex Albon, who I had earlier. That would leave me with 9.1. So assume Albon's here for argument's sake, which is where he was before. That would leave me with 9.1. I'd get in Lance Stroll as coverage for that Aston Martin. I know, and at least in my opinion, Fernando is a lot more reliable. He's more of a known commodity with what you're getting. You could get in Oscar Piastri, Lance Stroll, Alex Albon. No budget drivers per se. And I really like this flexibility because it gives me the option to hold on to Alex for Monza in a couple races time, where I think the straight line's part of the circuit will favour the Williams. You've got Oscar, as I mentioned, for the reasons that he can cover most of Lando's output. And then for Lance, again, wait and see. He hasn't really performed all that well lately, but if the upgrades for Aston Martin are favourable, and we do see that in practice before the deadline for the Dutch Grand Prix, then certainly a viable option. And as I said, it mitigates the risk of having any kind of risky budget drivers. So I really like this build. It's balanced. All drivers, you kind of know what you're getting from what we've seen so far, and another option I could potentially consider as well. I mean, as I said, I really like Lando, and I think he's an excellent fantasy asset, but for my team, I'm probably a little bit behind on budget compared to some of you guys watching this video, so I don't have quite the flexibility that I would like. I really like the team I had at the start as far as Lando, and maybe if you've got more budget, move Hulkenberg into someone like a Ricciardo or a Sonoda or someone. And then obviously the non-Lando builds with Oscar and then the McLaren constructor. So that's kind of where my team's at the moment. Again, a lot of variables, a lot of options, and I think it's great that McLaren are now on the radar for fantasy. Gives us a few more uh, optionality picks, a bit of variety with our team, and I think that will be pretty essential heading into the back half of the year. But anyway, I will aim to be back with a final thoughts video later in the week, so stay tuned for that. As I said at the start, if you're enjoying the content and you're liking what you see, please do subscribe to the channel. Very much appreciate it. If you don't hear from me before the end of the week, then check me out on Twitter. So, and as always, good luck with your teams this weekend, guys, and I'll see you all very soon.